anniversary of the UN Plan of Action on Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity. So it's a great opportunity to go deeper in the structure of this multi-stakeholder plan that is under the umbrella of the entire UN system, but should engage governments, civil society organizations, media organizations, journalists, and finding better ways to really advance in what we call the policy of the 3 Ps: prevention, protection, and prosecution of the crimes against journalists. When the plan was approved 10 years ago, many of the developments we have today, including many of the challenges related to the safety of women journalists, they were not that clear. So we have now an opportunity in this 10th anniversary to take stock of the lessons learned, some good lessons, but also some mistakes we all did in these 10 years in this endeavor of protecting and promoting the safety of journalists in general and women journalists in particular. So I think your discussion is timely, and I really ask you to send the conclusions to us, because this will be an important input for these year-long discussions we will have on how to make this UN plan on safety of journalism and the issue of impunity even more effective, considering all the challenges we have. And let me just quickly mention the challenges on those 3 Ps. In terms of prevention, although it should be the less costly kind of public policy, is the one that we invest less. We, all of us, but including UNESCO, so we acknowledge we should do more here. And prevention is about awareness campaigns. Prevention is about capacity building. Prevention is about developing, supporting the different stakeholders that are crucial in this process of protecting and avoiding crimes against journalists, women journalists, avoiding the threats, etc., how they could be better engaged in this process. So we need to do more here. UNESCO, for instance, with the International Women's Media Foundation, has launched with Texas University a global MOOC, a global massive online course for the safety of women journalists. And only the English version got more than 1,300 women journalists and students of journalism enrolled from 120 countries. So just to show that there is a demand, there is a need for that, for more capacity building, etc. So we should keep doing this. In the next weeks, we are going to launch this course in Spanish and French as well, and in the coming weeks in Arabic. So, but this is just a drop into the ocean. We need to do more in terms of prevention. In terms of protection, this is really fundamental. There are, as you know better than I do, a significant amount of specificities in developing protection measures for women journalists, and we need to go deeper in that. Two specific elements that were not that clear 10 years ago, and they are clearer now, is that women journalists, they suffer much more from the online violence against them, and then it's fundamental to develop specific protection mechanisms regarding this online violence. Women journalists, as it was the case of, for instance, Daphne Galicia in Malta, are also subjected to illegal procedures in courts trying to censor them, trying to make their journalistic work more difficult. And this is very much related to media regulation, to laws, and how we engage judicial operators in this conversation about safety of women journalists and their protection. So elements related to protection are fundamental. We need to have gender-based policies here. However, in the online environment, there is definitely a new player that should be much more present in our conversations, that are the internet companies. Without engaging them, it will be impossible to develop adequate public policies on the protection of women journalists online. And one fundamental element here is that these companies should be more transparent. We simply don't know how exactly, or if they are doing their policies, internal policies, to protect women journalists online. We don't know the data. So it's very difficult to produce evidence-based policy if we don't have the evidence. So it's fundamental here to insist in how these companies should be more engaged with this process. UNESCO has been doing extensive research here with the International Center for Journalists. During the World Press Freedom Day this year, we are going to launch a series of recommendations for these companies, for governments, related to the safety of women journalists online. And finally, in terms of prosecution, it's fundamental to pay strong attention in this component. Impunity just refuels the cycle of violence. And as you can imagine, the impunity in crimes against journalists in general and against women journalists in particular is almost 100%. So we need to empower the structures of prosecution services, of law enforcement agents, so that they are capable or equipped to do the prosecution of those cases in trying to break down the cycle of violence. As you could see, we have a very intensive agenda in this year of the 10th anniversary, and I do count on your support, on your insights, or on your data research and intelligence for us to make this UN plan better. And it's a lot related to safety. As you also saw, I couldn't mention a lot about media regulation, but I'm sure other speakers will do. But just to say that this is also in UNESCO agenda very highly, and that's why we are really engaging in permanent basis with media regulators, with judges, with prosecutors, because all those players that are related to media regulation, media law reform, and media law implementation are fundamental to include a gender-based perspective on that. I thank you very much for your attention. I apologize, Amy, I wouldn't be able to stay because we are having this special session in UNESCO regarding the current situation in Europe, but I'm super open to receive the conclusions of this meeting. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you very much to you, Guilherme Canella, and thank you also for arising these three challenging areas: prevention, protection, and prosecution. In fact, this is part of the findings that we will share with you. I mean, these, yes, are three critical dimensions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Mexico. So, and before starting with the first panel, I would like to publicly thank to Mr. Guy Berger, UNESCO's Director of Policies and Strategies in the field of communication and information, also, of course, to Guilherme Canella and all to the UNESCO team, because this research has been supported by UNESCO and the IPDC, but also because, in particular, Guy Berger has been a champion of gender equality issues within UNESCO. So, and also I would like to express my recognition to my colleagues, Ruchi Kumar, lead researcher in Afghanistan, Basma El Mahdi, lead researcher in Afghanistan, and to my colleagues, Lucia Lagunes and Daniel Esquivel, for joining the Mexico project. Also to my colleague, Sara Macharia, she's the General Director of GAMAC, and Albana Shala, whose advice has been key for the achievement of this. So what we are going to present in this session are the results of a project focused in women's journalists' human rights. Under the framework of the project titled Engendering, a National Mechanism for the Safety of Journalists, GAMAC focused its attention in the three most dangerous countries for women journalists in the world. I mean, Afghanistan, Mexico, and Iraq. The reason of our election is that there has been a hard increase of violence against women journalists offline and online in these three countries. National mechanisms for the protection of journalists have become an institutional response, but have failed to ensure safety of women journalists. One of the main reasons of this is the lack of a gender approach in the risk analysis and in the measures adopted by these mechanisms. This is why, based on this project, GAMAC's purpose is to develop a proposal to mainstream gender within the existing mechanisms. In Mexico, the CEDAW committee called for concrete measures to fully implement the federal mechanism in gender-sensitive manner. This happened in 2018. Iraq was included as one of the pilot countries for the UN Plan of Action for the Safety of Journalists and the Issue of Impunity. In Afghanistan, nevertheless, the last 20 years, women journalists faced many difficulties to build institutional mechanisms to access freedom of expression. They achieved important goals. However, the situation has only worsened since the Taliban takeover. While the group promised to respect women's rights, they have introduced rules to prevent women's public voice. Based on a common methodology for the two countries, researchers in first place evaluated national monitoring, reporting, protection, prevention, and prosecution mechanisms on safety of women journalists, and in second place, conducted an analysis of gender-based violence, threats against women journalists, and of the responses that have been developed to tackle these threats in these three countries, with particular attention to the issue of digital safety, an area where such threats are particularly visible. So we expected initiating this project in 2020. However, the coronavirus pandemic affected our original research plan. We had to postpone it, and doing most of the research, including interviews online and offline, and also in the particular case of Afghanistan, our colleague Ruchi Kumar, who has done an extraordinary work since the Taliban occupation in linking women journalists with GAMAG and other international organizations. She had to go out from the country. All this happened last year, but gladly we all are here. So in first place, I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Basma El Mahdi. She has been the lead researcher for Iraq. So Basma, please go ahead.
Thank you, Emily, for the introduction and for the opportunity to work with GAMAG and the other colleagues, Sarah and Ruchi, on this important project. I am Basma El Mahdi. I'm a journalist and researcher from Egypt, and I conducted the part of the research on Iraq. I will try briefly here to speak about three dimensions of our research. Firstly, I will talk about the violence against women journalists in Iraq, and then I will talk about the establishment of the mechanism in the country, and then we'll talk briefly on the gender dimensions of the national mechanism in Iraq. To put you in the wider context, for the last 2 years, I think we do live in critical times for journalists in Iraq, who not only have to do their job in a highly charged political climate, but also they subject for severe violations committed by armed groups and security forces. The dangers for women journalists, it's a double because they work in a wider context of government corruption and also political parties' control over the security establishment. They also vulnerable to additional gender-specific dangers. But when we try to get to the previous studies about what kind of danger they are faced, there was like a few studies which is we find very problematic, and also it was surprisingly that these studies was received in a very negative tone from the communities of journalists in Iraq, in a way that deny the existing problem that there is gender-based violence. And we when try to run our study, we also face challenges to reach to a wider sample when we run a survey in Arabic during last summer for 1 month. But also we try to support our data with conducting in-depth interviews with women journalists. Surprisingly, none of them were aware of the existing national mechanism for the safety of journalists. Back to the survey, the majority of our questions covered the different modalities of violence that they encounter when they're doing their journalistic activities. But also, A set of questions address the effectiveness of COVID-19 on them. And we found out that the majority of them, they have a very negative influences. Most of them either lost their jobs or have a less income during the lockdown. However, most of the most escaped questions in our survey was when we asked them about what kind of social and health protections their media institution provide them. When I will move to talk about the mechanism, a brief introduction to its creation, the creation of this mechanism. Back to the work of the UNESCO in 2015, which is published in 2019, UNESCO and its local partners recognize there is no national strategy, and there is temporary reactions, which is actually lead to high rate of impunity in Iraq. And between 2016 and 2019, the establishment of the national mechanism took place. But the newly born national mechanism was quite affected by the highly charged political climate in Iraq, that the official announcement of this mechanism happened twice in 2018 and 2019 because the government cabinet has a change. When it comes to the component of this mechanism itself, there is something called the Special Investigative Unit for Protection of Journalists, which is affiliated with the Minister of Interior. This is the core of this mechanism, as well as a group of field officers who are supervised by a body called the National Committee. Still, this mechanism work in progress, because until this moment there is no executive order that emphasizes its power and its independency in face of any political change. And they are waiting for a decree issued by the prime minister, who himself former journalist. For they waiting for this decree for the last 2 years. When we look on the gender dimension of this mechanism, on the operation level at least, there is no gender balance in recruiting the board members of the national committee. We only found 3 members of total 14 members are women. However, when we look at the monitoring level of this mechanism, there was kind of incorporating for the gender dimensions. We found that there is something called the paper-based database on the violation, which is have the aggregated data on the inequality and discrimination which is Iraqi women journalists may experience, such as physical appearance-based discrimination and sexual harassment by male colleagues or managers or sources. However, there is a big challenges faced us. There is no digital version of this data, and it's divided between 3 governmental bodies who has different copies of this data. On reporting level, women journalists revealed various reasons behind their reluctance to report the risks they were exposed. Because one of them, the main reason for that, that the police community is dominated by males in a very conservative community or societies in Iraq. Of course, not all the communities are conservative, but like a majority are. And also the social stigma prevents women from going to police station. To overcome this gender-based barrier, the UNESCO in Iraq, with the Ministry of Interior, established hotline for media workers in general, who has female policies offers, who can oversee receiving their phone calls. However, still the fear of reporting.
Basma, I think that there is some problem with your internet connection.
Okay, I'm sorry for that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, Great.
Okay, I'm sorry for that. Yeah. Okay, I will get back to the last point about the barriers that facing reporting this violence, that also the political context, because security and policy forces are controlled by powerful political and religious figures and their supported militias. What we are recommend for the existing mechanism, that they should require understanding and consideration of the existing different experiences of women and men, and those who have gender identities in Iraq. For instance, in newsroom, we recommended that they implement gender policies and anti-harassment measures, and for the educational institution and international NGO to promote gender sensitivity and safety, to hold gender-sensitive monitoring disaggregated data by gender, type of attacks, lack of data on perpetrator of sexual attacks. I think there is a lot I can share with you, but given the limited time that we have, and I will hand it over to my colleague Ruchi to speak about her research in Afghanistan.
Thank you very
And
much.
thank you, everyone.
Thanks to you, Basma. A great introduction to the findings of the report on Iraq. And we want to announce that we plan to launch the publication of this project by this year. So now, as said, this is the turn of our colleague Ruchi Kumar, who has been the lead researcher for Afghanistan. Please, Ruchi, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I am Ruchi Kumar. I'm from India. I am a journalist and I worked in Afghanistan for 7 years. 6 of those I was based there. This research was a very interesting experience for me personally, because I discovered a lot of interesting achievements as well as challenges that my Afghan female colleagues faced while doing the same job that I was doing. But because they had to work a lot harder to be able to be journalists, to report, to be part of the media scene. As part of the research, we conducted a survey and we interviewed 130 female Afghan journalists from across 25 provinces. There are 34 provinces in Afghanistan. We were not able to find female journalists in 9 of those provinces. This doesn't mean that there were no women working in the media in those provinces. It's just that they were so few that it was really hard to reach them. It was really hard to be able to get their opinions as part of this report. But we did manage to cover 25 provinces. And I just want to share a little bit about what we found in those surveys. I also want to add that there was a lot of, because while we were working on this research, there were a lot of challenges that we faced, including security, including connectivity, infrastructure. And then in the last leg of our research, the Afghan government fell and the Taliban took over the country, which basically meant that a lot of the work that we did was historical rather than relevant. So it really affected how we were working, and it really affected our findings. But I'll try and summarize everything here. So we interviewed 130 female journalists. Aside from that, we interviewed media lawyers, activists, and also journalist safety organizations that work in Afghanistan. Some of the journalists, because they didn't have internet connectivity, so we had to literally pick up the phone, call them, have really long interviews with them, transcribe these interviews, and then fill out the survey forms. But that gave us an additional perspective on what women go through, because we got to hear a lot of personal stories. What we did not get to do was speak to government officials who are part of the few mechanisms that did exist under the by the Afghan government to help women journalists, help journalists in general. We did not get to do that because by the time we got to the government officials, the government had already fallen. But here's what we learned. So we learned that women experience a lot of different challenges. About 30% of them, 1/3 of them, said that they experience psychological violence, which was basically harassment from colleagues, from family members, from the public while going out for reporting. About 20% of them said they faced economic violence. They found that they were not being paid for the jobs they do. They were being discriminated against. And about 11% of them said that they experienced physical violence, where they were actually physically attacked while they were out reporting, or even sometimes, within the newsrooms, or at times, unfortunately, even at home. 1/3 of these violence took place in public spaces, which meant that it was happening within society while they were out reporting, where they were not accepted because of the existing patriarchal cultural norms. 20% of them said that it happened within the media organizations, which means that it was being perpetrated by many of their colleagues. And just within the industry itself. 12% of them said that it happened at home. This was very interesting, or very sad rather, because a lot of the women journalists in Afghanistan, aside from having to face the usual challenges that journalists in general face, they had to face an additional layer of challenges coming from their own families. Not everybody's families were supportive. Not everybody was received the kind of, many of them were working without telling their families that they were part of the media, they were journalists. In many other cases, women were after they're married, they were not allowed to work. Like in one province where we found one journalist, one female journalist we managed to find, and when we reached her, she said, "Oh, sorry, I don't work anymore. I got married, and so there are no journalists in that particular province anymore. There are no women journalists, because the women journalist that represented that province was no longer there." Since the violence was so diverse, the mechanisms that were available were not able to cover the length and the breadth of the problems that the women face. But this doesn't mean that there weren't any. There were media laws. There were lawyers and activists who had been working and building. There were a lot of civil society organizations that worked to build stronger institutions, so that women, journalists in general and women in particular, would feel more comfortable approaching the legal, the criminal, the legal setups to report crimes that they face, like the violations that they face. There was one very interesting mechanism that we learned of, was a committee that had been set up by the Vice President's office. This committee was basically members of the Afghan government from different ministries, civil society organizations, media organizations, and they met once a month. And journalists could approach this committee to report of the crimes that they face. The committee would sit and deliberate, and then depending on the merits of the case that they would investigate, they would push the law and order arms, whether it was the Ministry of Interiors or the police, to further take action on the, or persecute the criminals. But this committee met only once a month, so they were able to only address a certain number of cases, and it was not a formal organization. It was not a formal institution. So it was making an impact, but it was not as diverse or as widespread as it should have been. But despite that, it was there. Despite that, there were laws were there. So that was something. Unfortunately, since the Taliban takeover, much of these institutions have crumbled. Much of these laws are so the Taliban has said that they promised that they would uphold the existing laws. However, at the same time, they've also introduced 11 rules for journalists, which many of these rules contradict the laws that exist, which has kind of created an environment where media freedoms have been restricted. Journalists are self-censoring. Aside from that, journalists who previously, prior to the fall of Afghan government, who reported against the Taliban, including the women, many of the women who reported on how the Taliban's treatment of women was, and how women were, women were resisting the Taliban. These journalists have faced a lot of pressure from the Taliban. They face threats from the Taliban fighters. The Taliban, as as the current de facto government, may not be persecuting them, may not be prosecuting them in courts, but individual fighters and commanders have been pressuring these journalists. A lot of the women have been taken off air. The Taliban has not particularly banned Afghan women from the newsroom, but they have not created an environment that welcomes women back into the newsrooms. In certain provinces, they have actually gone ahead and, for instance, taken women off the radio because women's voices are not, so women are not allowed to be radio hosts. Because women's voices should not be heard by the public. So in some other provinces, women are not allowed on television. I just want to share some figures that I have from, I personally haven't been to Afghanistan in 7 months. So my information on the ground comes from the journalists that I speak to who are still over there, journalists and activists who are still fighting to get for their rights. They're appealing to the Taliban de facto government to give them protection, or to allow them, give them the space to be able to practice journalism. So I want to share just some figures from organizations who've conducted surveys in the more recent, since after we did, on the state of media in Afghanistan, particularly of women in Afghanistan. From February 2022, IFJ, this is from an IFJ survey, 318 media houses have closed down since August 15. 51 TV stations have closed down, 132 radio stations have closed down, 49 online media houses have closed down, media platforms have closed down. While we were conducting the survey, our research a year ago, there were 1,300 women journalists formally employed in Afghanistan. 1,300 formally employed women journalists, however, many more who were working as freelancers and in other capacities. As of February 2022, there were only 243 women working in Afghanistan as in media. An earlier report by RSF said that there are fewer than 100 women journalists formally working in Kabul, in the capital. In the country, but in 76 women were working in Kabul in media, and only 39 women journalists in Kabul in the media. The stories of Afghan women across the country are being told. The weight and the pressure of the stories to convey these stories of the women is currently on 39 women journalists in Kabul. This has been really very damaging to the overall freedom of speech, freedom of expression in Afghanistan, primarily because while there's a lot of self-censoring, there are a lot of women who want to tell their stories. There are a lot of women who want to come forward and be part of the narratives. There are women who protest and take to the streets pretty much every second day in Afghanistan, despite the risk, despite the pressure. They've been detained, they've been tortured, they've been, and they still come out because they want to be part of the society, particularly the journalists. And I would like to read one message from one of the Afghan women journalists I spoke to recently, who I will only identify here as Mariam. She lost her job when one of the media houses that I mentioned shut down, because the media would not, the publication would not, was not allowed to bring women back into the newsroom. They were not able to, and they were not allowed to. She says that I always tell people to follow your heart, and if you think something is not right, stand up against it. And I would still say so, and I'm fighting for these rights even though I'm in hiding currently. Because if we are not part of the media, who will speak for us and who will tell our stories? I have participated in some protests recently, and I saw how hard it is for Afghan women to fight. We as women cannot believe how dramatically things have changed for us overnight. Earlier, we were fighting to bring equality. Now we have to fight for our basic rights. So yes, it is very hard for women to follow these unrealistic rules and demands, whether they dictate our clothes or whether they dictate our right to work. Basically, Afghan women journalists are currently not part of the larger discussion that's happening in Afghanistan. There are some of them who are doing it, but they're not they have not been allowed to, their voices have not been allowed to be part of the media, or they have been restricted. So there's very little that you hear about what's happening to Afghan women in the country, because Afghan women are not speaking for them. The way Afghanistan is, it is very, very crucial. I'm sure it's crucial everywhere in the world, but the way Afghanistan is, culturally, it is very crucial for women to be part of the media and the media landscape, because if women are not part of it, you will not hear the stories from women, because men cannot access these stories. The country is culturally, gender segregated. So some of the recommendations that we want to make based on our experience conducting this research, plus also based on the experience of witnessing what has happened since then, is that first and foremost, there is a very, very urgent need to support and protect women journalists who are at risk. Many of the women journalists who spoke up against the Taliban prior to the fall of Kabul are still at risk. They're still being hunted. They're still running from province to province, hiding in places because they are afraid that they will be persecuted for the work they've done. The second important thing is to put pressure on the current de facto Taliban government to implement and honor the Afghan laws that have existed before the fall. They have said that they will, but a lot of their own rules contradict the existing laws. So there's a need to put pressure on the Taliban to implement these laws, to respect these laws, and to create institutes and to create platforms where journalists, particularly women, can approach if they feel that their rights have been violated. There's also a need to pressure the Taliban to pave the way for women to come back to newsrooms. 39 women in Kabul is not a good number, is not a sufficient number to be telling. These 39 women are incredibly brave and they're doing an amazing job, but it is not right for the pressure to fall on them to tell the story of Afghan women. So the Taliban need to, or the world, the international community need to pressure the Taliban to pave the way to bring back women into the newsrooms. And last, but not the least, is that Afghan women still want to tell their stories, whether they are in hiding, whether they are, anonymous. And the international medias and publications and the community need to create platforms that allow women to tell these stories. So a lot more international publications need to hire women, Afghan women journalists, and honor and respect their rights, and at the same time treat them fairly. And I think that's about all I have to say.
Thank you very much to you, Ruchi, for doing this research under the conditions that you have explained. And as said, you have played a key role to link all those women journalists with the international community. And I just want to take one of the points you have raised, which is linked to what Guilherme said about here the responsibility of the corporations, the media corporations, with these women journalists. So at GAMAC, we are planning as a follow-up of this first step, and how to call the attention of these corporations for ensuring working conditions for these women in and out the country. So now is the turn of the Mexico case. And my colleague Lucia Lagunes and I will introduce to you some of the main findings. The last 2 years, 65 journalists have been murdered in Mexico. This year, 8 journalists have been killed. Just yesterday, a journalist was assassinated in the state of Michoacan. Because of the gender condition, the level of risk of women journalists is higher. According to our research, vulnerable conditions have increased during the pandemic. Women journalists in Mexico have faced different types of violence, such as physical, psychological, sexual, economic, and femicides in their workplaces and at their homes. The Mexican government has so far done little to address the problem. In fact, in October 2020, the Congress approved the presidential initiative of eliminating the trust fund that had allowed the protection mechanism for human rights defenders and journalists to implement protection measures that have helped protect more than 1,700 people who were on the street. The lack of human and financial resources has dramatically limited the mechanism's capacity to do its job properly. Currently, the Mexican government is planning to substitute the existing law by a new one that represents a serious risk for journalists and human rights defenders. My colleague Lucia Lagunes will explain further on this. In addition to that, the Mexican president has launched a public hostility toward journalists during his daily morning press briefings that has exacerbated the risk conditions for those women journalists who have challenged his policies, including those in response to the COVID pandemic and the persisting impunity. The report in Mexico undertook a comprehensive research of the mechanism, its structure, and the path followed for the improvement of protection measures for women journalists. Researchers were able to access to existing statistical data on women journalists victims of violence that have requested protection to the mechanism. Also, we interviewed representatives of the mechanism, but also of those institutions, organizations, and UN agencies represented at the governing board. An interview to a displaced woman journalist under the protection of the mechanism was included. And as my colleagues in Iraq and Afghanistan, we also did a survey with Mexican journalists. I would want to share with you some of the numbers. Okay, we interviewed 137 women journalists around the country, and some of them were reporters, but also we included women working in other fields, also in internet media, press, TV, radio, and other media. Okay, at the beginning, Guilherme Canela spoke about the importance that digital violence is raising this issue. However, what we found, and we want to emphasize this is that online violence against women journalists is a continuous of the offline violence that they experience. So in our survey, we included these dimensions of violence against women journalists, such as physical violence, sexual, psychological, economic, patrimonial, and femicide. So what you will see is that women journalists in Mexico experience different types of violence linked to the gender condition. In the case of physical violence, you can see here, and we can share after this session the results of the survey, that they experience different specific types of physical violence, but also of sexual violence, psychological violence, economic, patrimonial, and some of them have been treated of being murdered. Also, what we have found is that the spaces where they have been treated or punished are places linked to their work. So here also we want to emphasize the importance of approaching to the analysis of gender-based violence against women journalists as an attempt to the work they do, and at the end of the day, as an attempt to freedom of expression and to the access of information of society. And in the case of online violence, what we have seen is that there is an increasing of this specific violence, but again, it's important to raise attention about the link between the online violence and the offline violence that these women experience. This is for us an important finding, and is linked to the aggressors. Most of the aggressors are representatives of the media where these women work. And in second place, aggressors come from the state. I mean, state representatives, I mean, policemen, congressmen, heads of federal offices used to be some of the main aggressors of women journalists. Also, information sources, criminal groups, private corporations, and what we have seen also is the increase of violence coming from narco groups, and probably my colleague Lucia Lagunes can explain further on this. For us, it was important to explore the impact of this violence on the integrity of these professionals. So what we can see here is that the effects are multiple, diverse. We can see here that the effects are psychological, economic, physical, and these effects have also an effect on society, as the self-censorship is a way for them to protect or to feel protected of further violence. So Guilherme Canela also spoke about the impunity issue. Here, what we can see is that in Mexico, the level of impunity is higher. We could say that according to Article 19, 90% of those acts of violence against women journalists are on the impunity. And of course, with the pandemic, these conditions have worsened. We can see here that most of these women journalists have moved to a part-time modality of their jobs, that they have now multiple tasks for the same salary or even for a less salary. And so in conclusion, what we can say is that the conditions of women journalists in Mexico have worsened the last few years. So now I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Lucia Lagunes, to introduce the results of our analysis of the national mechanism. Lucia, por favor.
Muchas gracias, Jaime, y muchas gracias a todas y todos por estar esta mañana, tarde, noche, dependiendo del lugar donde se encuentran, y acompañarnos en esta reflexión que pues GAMAC ha impulsado en esta investigación. Efectivamente, como señala Jaime, el mecanismo de protección en México cumple este año 10 años, una década de existencia para la protección de periodistas y personas defensoras de derechos humanos. En estos 10 años, digamos, ha habido avances en la incorporación de la perspectiva de género, pero solo en dos dimensiones. Una que tiene que ver con el reconocimiento de la violencia sexual hacia las mujeres periodistas, prácticamente como el principal motivo de género que pudieran reconocer, y otro tiene que ver con una condición de su maternidad, ¿no? Y su dependencia de otras personas. Sin embargo, el mecanismo de protección hoy enfrenta retos importantes, en el sentido de que esta nueva ley que se está proponiendo por parte del gobierno mexicano implica que desarrollen en cada entidad federativa mecanismos locales. Estos mecanismos locales estarían a cargo de los análisis de riesgo y de la creación de los planes de protección para personas defensoras y periodistas. Esta iniciativa que lanzó el gobierno mexicano en diciembre del 2021 y que ha iniciado unas reuniones estatales por entidades federativas. Hasta el día de hoy hay 4 que se han realizado. No está garantizando la presencia de las mujeres periodistas para precisamente escuchar de viva voz lo que están enfrentando y cuáles tendrían que ser los elementos que habría que considerar para poder garantizar una verdadera perspectiva de género en sus análisis de riesgo y sus planes de protección. Aquellas periodistas que han logrado estar dentro de estos diálogos han señalado reiteradamente que no están de acuerdo en que las instancias estatales sean las responsables de su protección, toda vez que, como lo señalan los resultados de la investigación, los agresores de las periodistas son agentes del Estado, agentes de entidades federativas, de los gobiernos de las entidades federativas, razón por la cual las propias periodistas han señalado que se sentirían mucho más en riesgo si sus propios agresores son los que tienen que protegerlas. Sin embargo, el gobierno federal no está escuchando precisamente las razones por las cuales las mujeres periodistas e incluso los compañeros varones han señalado su negativa a que este mecanismo de protección se traslade a las entidades federativas por los riesgos que esto implicaría. Porque los mecanismos como siguiendo el modelo del mecanismo federal, dependen del Ministerio del Interior, que en México se conoce como la Secretaría de Gobernación. Si bien en su conformación cuenta con representantes de gobierno, es importante señalar que está la sociedad civil representada a través del Consejo Consultivo del Mecanismo de Protección. Y este Consejo Consultivo, en el cual participamos mujeres feministas, ha sido una pieza clave precisamente para impulsar dentro del mecanismo de protección una perspectiva más integral y a favor de los derechos humanos de las mujeres periodistas y defensoras, porque este mecanismo busca proteger a ambas poblaciones, ¿sí? Tanto periodistas como defensoras. Como parte de esta investigación que realizamos con las entrevistas que se llevaron a cabo y a profundidad, tanto con personas que forman parte de la estructura del mecanismo, como de aquellas instancias de autoridad que forman parte de la Junta de Gobierno, que es precisamente la instancia máxima del mecanismo de protección, me parece que hay lecciones aprendidas que podrían replicarse precisamente dentro del mecanismo. Y una de ellas creo que tiene que ver efectivamente con garantizar que aquellas unidades de género que están dentro de las instituciones gubernamentales sean asesoras permanentes, cotidianas, en el trabajo que realiza el mecanismo de protección, tanto al momento de las entrevistas con las mujeres periodistas, como al momento del diseño, de la implementación del análisis de riesgo y el plan de protección para superar una mirada que se tiene en el mecanismo de protección, que es una mirada policial de la protección. Es decir, una mirada que se centra en acciones duras, como pueden ser chalecos antibalas, autos blindados, escoltas, y que deja a un lado la visión de derechos humanos, que no garantiza precisamente que las mujeres periodistas sean reconocidas como sujetas de derechos humanos y no solo como objetos de protección, que es una de las miradas precisamente que se sigue manteniendo en esta propuesta de la nueva ley que está haciendo el gobierno mexicano y que, como bien lo señalaba Aimé, podría generar mayor desprotección precisamente para las mujeres periodistas. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Lucia Lagunes. As said, we plan to publish the report by this year. So we have come to the end of this first part of the joint session.